Welcome to the Unitarian Universalist Church of Brunswick, Maine. My name is Bill Clark. I'm a member of the Board of Trustees. I'm sad that we cannot be physically together on this Easter Sunday of 2020. However, we are pleased to be able to offer a virtual service and glad that you were able to join us. You can get more information about this church at uubrunswick.org.
Everything changes with the dawn, on Easter and every day. Each new day brings the possibility of new life, new growth, new learning. Each new day births hope anew. May this new day, this Easter in a time of pandemic, open our hearts to hope and love. May this new day, this Easter day in a time of pandemic, remind us that just as seeds come to life in soil, so too do the seeds of our true growing take root in the soul.
On Christmas, people all over the world come together and they talk about the birth of Jesus, and they celebrate Jesus' birthday. That makes a lot of sense. I love celebrating birthdays. But on Easter, we do something different. We talk a lot about the death of Jesus. That's hard to talk about, and it's certainly something that's hard to celebrate. So why do we do it? Well, one reason is that no one is exactly sure what happened to Jesus after he was buried. Some claim that he miraculously rose from the dead and opened a beautiful kingdom called heaven where all people are treated kindly and equally. As Unitarian Universalists, the main reason I think we talk about Jesus' death is because Jesus was an incredibly brave man who chose to live a very different life than most people of his time, and ultimately he was punished for it by being put to death. Jesus chose to be poor, and he got very upset when people would put money before people. Jesus felt driven to travel all over Israel to talk to people about these different kinds of beliefs that he had. He gave up having a regular home, and he gave up having a bed to sleep in. People found his messages so powerful that they would crowd around him when he would speak, and he even had a small group of people who would travel with him. These were called his disciples. Jesus was a Jewish man, but he thought that many of the Jewish leaders and authorities had lost their way. See, Jesus believed that people should be kind and loving, and he taught this. He thought that men and women, no matter where they came from, were equals. Jesus believed in being kind and helping those who need our help. He said that we could see God's love in our loving relationships with other people. Jesus knew that he was upsetting the people in power. He was telling people that putting money first was wrong and that God loved all of God's children, that it was more important to be a loving person than a powerful person. It made the authorities very nervous that Jesus was so popular with people and that his messages were so different than theirs. They feared that Jesus would turn people against them. Jesus, he knew that he was going to be in big trouble with the authorities, but he believed in his heart that the messages of kindness, equality, and courage were important messages, and he had to keep on teaching them no matter what the consequences. In the springtime of Jesus' last year, he went to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover, which is a holiday we talked about last week, a very special holiday in the Jewish tradition. While Jesus was in Jerusalem, the priests and rich bankers went to the Roman governor, Pontius Pilate, and they demanded that Jesus be arrested. Jesus was arrested, and after he was arrested, the powerful people insisted that he be put to death, even though he had committed no real crime. In those days, criminals were killed by being nailed to a cross, and that was called being crucified. Jesus was put up on a cross on a hill between two thieves. And after he died, a good man named Joseph came to the authorities and asked to take away Jesus' body and put him in a tomb carved out of a rocky hillside. The powerful people insisted that a stone be put in front of the tomb and that there be guards. Because Jesus was so popular, they didn't want people coming to grieve at his graveside. On Sunday morning, when the women who had been closest to Jesus went to his tomb with spices and perfumes to put on his body, they found that the stone had been rolled away from the tomb. But when they entered, they did not find Jesus' body. The tomb was empty.
This is a reading from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 28, verses 1 through 10.
After the Sabbath, at dawn on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb.
There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord came down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it.
His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow.
The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men.
The angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know you are looking for Jesus, who is crucified.
He is not here. He has risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the woman hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples.
Suddenly Jesus met him. "Greetings," he said. They came to him and clasped his feet and worshipped him.
Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee. There they will see me."
The Tomb is Empty by Carl Scoville. An Episcopal bishop once told me a story about Easter that has stayed with me for many years. It seems that a fourth grade religious education teacher in an Alabama church that he served was trying to explain the Easter story to her children and told them the story of the empty tomb. Then she gave each of them a plastic shell, the kind that pantyhose used to come in. She asked the children to return the next Sunday with something in that shell that reminded them of the empty tomb. On the next Sunday, they opened their eggs. One had a flower, one had a tiny felt bunny, one had a small picture of Jesus. Eventually, they came to a boy who was mentally handicapped. He was older than the other children because he had been held back for 2 years. He knew it, and the other children knew it. They were uncomfortable with him and avoided him, occasionally mocking him behind the teacher's back. When his turn came, there was nothing inside when he opened his shell. The other children snickered. The boy said something rather incoherent, trying to explain his presentation, and the teacher listened to him carefully. Then she looked up to the others and said, "He means the empty tomb." The boy, of course, had gotten it. The empty place is the first sight and symbol of the Christian faith, an absence rather than a presence. And with that space and absence comes a sense that the world is not as simple as we imagined it. For all its laws and patterns, the world still has surprises. Who could have guessed that a community of martyrs and witnesses would come out of this tiny ragtag group of confused, abandoned followers? Who would have guessed that a man who was choked to death at a stake would become the center of a worldwide religion? Who would have guessed that the power of his message lives today? Who would have guessed what would have come out of that empty tomb?
In my wildest dreams, I could not have imagined a stranger Easter than this one. Easter is meant for families and friends gathering and feasting. It's meant for Easter egg hunts and singing hymns. It's meant for all kinds of things that mean pulling people together. And here we are in a time of pandemic, isolated and apart. I could never have imagined this. What are we to make of such a situation? What are we to make of Easter in a time of pandemic? Well, to think about that, I'd like to start with a story. Way off in far away Texas, there exists the most surprising place. You travel on the paved road for quite a long time, and then you turn off onto the dirt road and travel a long time more, leaving clouds of dust in your wake. And eventually you reach your destination, a graveyard. But not an ordinary graveyard. This one is unusual in one particular aspect. On the top of nearly every grave grows an oak tree, a solid, strong, tall oak tree, tall enough to cast a shadow on the gravestones that lie behind it. There are no other stands of trees nearby. No town lies nearby, though apparently there was one long ago, a hard-scrabble town consisting of little but dust and wind. As far as the eye can see, only flat, dry, and dusty prairie composes the landscape. But in that barren, deserted landscape, oak trees grow right on top of the graves, right out of the graves, in fact, bones and roots twisted together, death and life twisted together. How can that be? Gerald Callahan describes this graveyard in his book, Faith, Madness, and Spontaneous Human Combustion. He writes, "Everything is nailed in place by faith. Everything is nailed in this place by faith. Everything is red with hope. Men and women who left log or brick homes in Europe or New England for sod huts in the middle of this prairie, droughts and plagues of grasshoppers that took everything but the dirt, stillborn children and dust storms that blackened July noons dark as coal mines, livestock that dried up like figs or swelled up with the bloat, women who, in spite of it all, bore children out here, then somehow found ways to give those children enough hope to gather up the tools their parents had left them and press on. And now, a tall, sturdy oak tree grows out of nearly every grave. As it turns out, in the olden days in that long-forgotten, now vanished town, the burial practice was to lay an acorn under the hands of the dead. Under those hands, so carefully folded across still and quiet chests, the acorns sprouted and took root. They grew into tall, healthy trees. A tiny bundle of faith, that acorn, swaddled by grief and desolation. So tiny, compared to the monumental losses the people shoveling dirt into those graves must have felt at the time. But what an extraordinary expression of faith and hope, that out of sorrow joy can return buoyant and strong, that out of despair hope can percolate and bubble to the surface once again, that out of death life can be born again. Today we celebrate Easter, mysterious and hopeful, a holiday that teaches us that death cannot steal away hope or love, or even ultimately life. That's a worthy reminder in this time of pandemic. Strange as these days are, and they are strange, are they really any different from the human experience across all the generations? Humans have faced fear, challenge, difficulty, privation, grief, and death forever, and will continue to do so until the end of time. And yet, in spite of it all, maybe even because of it all, human beings have also developed the great capacity to harness hope in bleak times, to love, even when loss will always be the ultimate outcome, and to move bravely forward through the ages with courage, imagination, and strength. The ultimate loss, death itself, cannot steal away hope or love or even life. Imagine. The old stories tell us about the tomb, suggesting the miracle is that Jesus' tomb was empty. But what if the miracle is really this, that all tombs are ultimately empty of loss, because the laws of nature work on the tomb's contents and create new life. Out of dust and bones, mighty oak trees can gain nourishment and grow, death transformed to life. Even in dusty, God-forsaken soil, a forest can emerge, fed by what came and went before. Bones and roots twisted together. And one day, when the oak trees themselves will die, as surely they will, once again, that death will fertilize the earth so that the next beautiful thing can emerge. Death and life locked in mysterious dance steps that we can only but glimpse, where life, not death, has the last word in the natural world. That is the first lesson of the empty tomb, then. The enduring seasons of nature can supply us with bold hope. But there is more. The laws of the human heart also determine what lives and dies. When my son was young, my family did not celebrate Easter. It seemed so much simpler that way, at least for us. But then when my son was nearly 2 years old, my oldest friend died in a car accident. Frank died in October, and for the long, cold months of winter, my broken heart cried out in despair. Frank had been a wonderful friend, a faithful friend, really more of a brother than a friend. And then he was gone, simply gone. Months later, as snow and ice began to give way to spring, I could sense my heart, too, beginning to melt. And that spring, for the first time, our family celebrated Easter, setting out a basket so that the bunny could come. For me, that celebration was one of my first brave steps to claim the good of Frank's life, to honor the depth of his friendship, and to set his spirit free so that it could live on through me. That is the second lesson of the empty tomb, then. The human heart carries love and life forward, even in the face of devastation. The human heart can set free the spirits of those we love and lose. And there is yet more. Today we remember that Jesus befriended the forgotten, the sick, the despised and rejected. He took to task those who oppressed, those who were steeped in hypocrisy, those who were wed to affluence and power, those who turned their backs on the suffering of others. His radical and electric message was, love God with all your heart, mind, and spirit, and your neighbor as yourself. That work of love is still undone and is now ours to do in a world that still calls out for the kind of healing that Jesus promoted. We can work to be the hands and voices that labor to create a world governed by love. As so beautifully described in A COVID Easter by local blogger Elaine de Freitas. She writes, Jesus said, "Take care of creation." And we said, "We can't. We're too important. And we need to travel by car, by plane. And we need to buy all the things wrapped in plastic. And we need to make more food, more stuff, more money, more." Jesus said, "Take care of the needy." And we said, "We can't. We're too busy. And we don't have enough time. And we don't have enough resources. And we don't want to anyway." Jesus said, "Take care of the children." And we said, "We can't. We need them to be successful. And they need to pass the tests. And they need to know and do more. And they need to not hold us back." Jesus said, "Then I must show you another way. I must die so that you can live." And in the face of death, the whole world stopped. And there was no more travel. And we stopped buying more. And we opened our eyes to our community and took care of those with needs. And we spent time with the children, and we let them show us their world. 3 days later, Jesus said, "Now go and tell the good news." With the threat of death removed, there were many who returned to their old ways. And there were still more who remained paralyzed in the anxiety of the death. And there were also those who saw the light, who recognized new life for what it was. And although their numbers were few, they began to live the good news. And the good news began to change the world. That is the third lesson of the empty tomb, that the message of love is stronger than death, so long as people will heed Jesus' central teaching of love. The world is not as simple as we imagine it, Carl Scoville writes. For all its laws and patterns, the world still has surprises, endings that are beginnings. Oak trees adorning the trees, oak trees adorning the graves in a desolate graveyard in Texas. Love that does not die. Tragedy that inspires us to remake our world. A river of hope running through the human heart. Out of sorrow, joy can return buoyant and strong. Out of despair, hope can percolate and bubble to the surface once more. Out of death, life can be born again. The tomb is empty, and we might well be amazed. So may it be. Amen, and happy Easter.
And 12 months later, she's had time to think, and she's written it down on her body in ink. Now she carries it with her wherever she goes. A portrait coming up through the snow. And at the tattoo parlor, when they said it would hurt, well, she couldn't help laughing out loud as she took off her shirt. And now she carries it with her wherever she goes. A portrait of a life coming up through the snow. In the small of her back, in the colors of spring, on the first anniversary of this terrible thing, one small crocus reaches out before the sun, a promise that winter is ending and spring has begun. And she carries it with her wherever she goes. A portrait of a life coming up through the snow.
Let us be together in the spirit of meditation and prayer. Spirit of love and renewal. As sun begins to warm our earth, as leaves begin to bud and bulbs begin to flower, we enter a season of rebirth. Through all the long winter, through nights and days of cold and ice, we have known this day would come. We have had faith in the earth's ancient orbit, in the march of the seasons, and the sun's long-awaited return. Now we bend to the growing light and new life. And yet our hearts are heavy this day too, for our human family, struggling so with sickness and loss, with fear and loneliness. May the warming season kindle ever-growing compassion and love in each of our hearts, that we might be gentle, kind, and loving with our neighbors and ourselves. May the growing season kindle hope in our hearts too. May the old story of the empty tomb open us to the possibility of surprise, change, imagination, and renewal. so may it be. Amen. For those who are lonely in these days of isolation, may this Easter bring the comfort of the longer story, the longer view, and the hope of reconnection. For those who are afraid, may this Easter bring a reminder that even in times of great fear, rivers of hope run through the human heart, generation after generation. For all who are grieving, may this Easter bring the promise of rebirth, the promise of life made new from what we have lost. For those who seek hope and love, may this season of unstoppable growing lead the way. Happy Easter. Amen.